Senator Lutchmedial.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for the opportunity to contribute today on this bill. Mr. Vice President, I'll be very short because I think a lot has already been said on a number of the matters arising in this bill. I would start by just saying that, there's a famous saying that insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. So what I'm really hoping for is that, and perhaps at committee stage and as we flesh out this bill a little bit more, we really need to understand, and I think that the public needs to understand with respect to all legislation, what will be different with this SEZ regime that would deal with the issues and the non-performance that we've heard about under the present Free Trade Zone Act. What we are dealing with here today is not a new concept, really. It is a new regime, a new regulatory regime and legislative regime meant to fix something that is in existence and isn't working. So I understand the need for compliance with the international standards and so on, so that we are not allowing harmful tax practices. But there are other issues and that we are trying to address now with the introduction of this authority to establish and to govern the special economic zones. And I think it's important for us to understand what went wrong before and why and how the new regime would really address what would have been wrong before with our free trade zone regime. So, if the minister could just expand on that a little bit in her wrap-up, I think it would be appreciated by everyone here and I think the public in general. With respect to attracting investors into the country, which I know is a primary objective that we're seeking to have, met by this new regime, I do believe that there is some merit in the suggestion that expertise in marketing, and specifically including it as part of one of the functions of the board, I think there's a lot of merit in that. Because, you see, it isn't really fair or in the interest of the country as a whole in terms of attracting foreign direct investment if we have the operators, the persons who we give the operators licenses to operate the zone, but you're not just marketing the zone, you have to market the country as a whole as an attractive place for investment. And the operators would be limited in their scope and how much they can do if they are operating the zone and what they can introduce and what they can do. So the board, I think, has to play a better role so that you have that connectivity between the operators, the board that's regulating the system that's in place, but the wider country as a whole, so that the marketing of the country as an attractive place to come and invest in these zones that are located here would really be something that could, achieve the objective of having a greater amount of foreign direct investment. I think we also have to ensure that the structure of the Commission and its powers that they have in carrying out their functions do not act as a deterrent. And I would speak a little bit about that and some of the concerns I have with respect to the composition of the board, the role of the minister, and licensing and inspection and so on. But overall, the entire regime that is encapsulated in this bill must also not be a deterrent to people who are looking to invest. When you're trying to attract people into your country, you must strike that balance between ensuring that there's no untoward activity in a zone like this, but you also don't want to overregulate and make it difficult and make it challenging so that it's a turn-off from investors. Because, of course, the zone, even though, yes, it is a physical place and there's the physical environment must be conducive as well for investment, you also have to look at your regulatory environment and ensure that that is, because the regulatory environment is just as important as the physical environment when you are looking to attract investors into your country. Now, when I was looking up on just doing some general research on special economic zones and looking for, success stories, and I came across a presentation done by, in collaboration with the OECD, but specifically with the MENA area, Middle East and North Africa, that they work with the OECD, and they did a presentation on designing economic zones for effective investment promotion. And there were a couple of things that I saw that they mentioned, and they look at some of the countries in that MENA area that were very successful in implementing special economic zones. And I thought that they were very, some of them we have, and I thought some of them, we can look at a little bit more and take into account what they are doing. One of the things that stood out for me that a lot of countries did, for example, Abu Dhabi, Egypt, and others, is that there were vocational training centers set up as part of the zones and in conjunction with the zones to ensure the supply of a skilled labor force. At the end of the day, we are not looking at these zones to just be manufacturing for and trying to promote exports. We are also including, and it's in the bill, in the schedule of the types of services that we're looking at to bring into these zones. You're looking at financial services. You are looking at medical, tourism. These are the things that you want to promote in the zone, and therefore you want to also make sure that if you're asking people to come into the country and invest in businesses like this, that you can supply a workforce. So I thought that there was some merit in those types of suggestions, and it seems to have been working a lot, and that's what the evidence that has been presented to the OECD by countries in that group, and they have endorsed that these specialized industrial zones and economic zones, they really look at the need to have a skilled workforce, so they do the vocational training centers, and they call them in certain areas, specialized sector clusters with training centers established by investors with the help of the ministries that are in charge of like vocational training, manpower planning, industrial training, and so on. That is the one in Egypt. My Senator Darren Ryan mentioned one-stop shop services. That's also something that has come out of that area where they have had success stories with special economic zones that they have also implemented. Another thing that contributed to the special economic zones was having a specific focus on ensuring that there was linkage between the management of the zones and the environmental, their version of the EMA, so that you do not have an impact, a negative environmental impact. Because, of course, long-term, and I think my colleague Senator Naked alluded to it, long-term environmental degradation is something that will work against the success of the economic zone. So on the one hand, you're trying to encourage investment and boost your exports and so on, but if on the other hand you have harmful practices that are harming your natural environment, your physical environment, that is not a trade-off that the country really will benefit from. So you want to have those types of things included, I think, in this bill. So some sort of consideration, I think, needs to be given to those things. Iraq even, and this is 2010 presentation, but even then, they talked about a human resource recruiting system built in with their special economic zones and in collaboration with the vocational training. So they're not just training people to work and to supply the labor, but they're also assisting with the placement of workers in the zones. So some of these things I thought we needed to consider a little bit further. When they went on, the OECD went on to examine as well in this presentation, which I thought was really helpful, what are some of the things that operate again and sort of operate as constraints when you're trying to promote these economic zones. And they looked at the regulatory framework, but they also considered specifically the incentive framework. And what they said is that despite the reliance on other incentives, many of the countries in that Middle East and North African area still resorted to excessive tax incentives without the use of sunset clauses, leading to windfall gains. So we know that part of the objective, a major part of the objective of this bill, is to ensure that we do not have harmful tax practices. We do not want to offend against the BEPS, the Action 5, and the EU Code and all of that. So I would like to ask the Minister if, in her winding up, if she could address the issue of having time-bound tax incentives in respect of this, because I know that in terms of the criteria that's set out in the schedule, they have done the eligibility criteria with respect to size of the firms, the amount of investment you expect, and so on. But I did not see here anything specifically dealing with a time frame for the types of tax incentives. And in the ministry's policy document that was put out before the bill, the Special Economic Zones Policy, it's dated July 2019. Specifically, when they talked about the incentive framework, it did say that the incentives would be time-bound, tied to the type and levels of investments and the size of the firms. So I see the types of investments, the levels of investments, and the size of the firms, but I'm not seeing anything specific to time. And I think that that would be a useful additional consideration, or at least, if not immediately, if something that we would, I don't know, leave to the board to decide later on about the tax incentives. Again, it is necessary to have a balance when you're looking at these things, because you do not want to upfront have a time-specific requirement for the tax incentives, which may deter investors because they know it is only X amount of time. But then at the same time, do you want that the discretion as to when these incentives may or may not end or could change just be up in the air and people don't know? Will it not be better for people to understand if they're coming to invest in one of these zones, well, how long can I really benefit from these exemptions and so on to go forward? So that's just by way of preliminaries, and I just want to then run through one or two things that I think are important when we're dealing with the bill. Firstly, because again, we want to have an attractive regulatory environment. The role of the minister, now, I've done a lot of comparison simply because it's familiar to me, and I've looked at the establishment of this board as compared to other types of regulatory organizations. And one of the most recent pieces of legislation, 2012, that was passed was the Securities Act. And I looked at the commission and the powers under the commission because they're very similar to this. Senator John raised the issue of the approval of the CEO. I do see a similar provision in the SEC Act. Again, what I have to say is that when you're looking at regulating your local environment, as opposed to having an environment where you want to attract foreigners, these things matter. So the structure of your commission, whether it is open to some sort of political influence, whether a CEO who is responsible for carrying out the mandate of the commission and so on can be influenced easily by the political directorate or can be changed when governments change and so on. Those things matter to an extent. But apart from that, I would also like some clarification when it talks about the CEO, whether the terms and conditions of the CEO would also be set by the minister, or whether it would have to be approved by the minister, or whether the board can do it. The Securities Act, for example, breaks it down and specifies that the minister must approve both, I think, the terms and conditions as well as the person themselves. So if that maybe is just a matter of drafting, if they can look at it and say whether or not all those things come under the remit of the minister or require his approval. In Clause 8.2 of the bill, I found it strange, this inclusion that policy directives could be given to the board by the minister. And it reminded me a little bit of the clause included in the contentious Trinidad and Tobago Revenue Authority bill, where, again, policy directives would be coming from a minister to a board. In that same document I referred to, where the OECD examined the success of SECs in the Middle East, one of the critical things that they pointed out is that you had independent regulators. And by independent, I'm sure they don't mean, yes, at the end of the day, you have people being appointed on the advice of the minister and so on. But I do feel that a minister being able to give policy directives to a board really oversteps and compromises the independence of that regulator. And that is something, again, that would not bode well for the confidence of investors if they feel that there is too much direct influence over the board and the regulator, because at the end of the day, this regulator has extensive powers, and I would come to that in a little while, but they have very extensive powers. And if a minister can give policy directives to a board that has such extensive powers, you don't know how that operates in the mind of the potential investor. And so I think that that is something that has to be considered, whether that clause 8.2 is really necessary. At the end of the day, yes, the government sets policy, and state boards carry out government's broad policy, but to be able to give actual directives from a minister to a board, I find that to be a little bit of an overstep, especially when you're dealing with a regulator who has, the power to impose fines and penalties and conduct inspections and all of that. And I tend to get to that in a little while. With respect to the composition of the board, I just have a few things that I want to point out. This board would be essentially exercising what is now commonly known as a quasi-judicial function because of the administrative sanctioning regime. And we have that at the central bank, we have it at the SEC, the FIU now to some extent are doing that. And I expressed these same concerns when that bill came with amending the FIU Act to introduce the administrative sanctioning regime, because you must look at the qualifications and criteria of persons who are sitting on a board when they're exercising those types of functions. So the Securities Act, for example, the 2012 one, and even the one that it repealed that was in existence before, the chairman of the board, I think in that act, had to be an attorney with at least 10 years experience, which is the same number of years experience as a high court judge, to be appointed a high court judge. So I think that they should give some consideration to that, whether or not we want to up the number of years of experience. In her presentation, the Honourable Minister mentioned that the appointment of the two lawyers would be, they would be appointed by the JLSC. But the bill actually, and I took note of that because in reading the bill, it said appointed by the minister on the advice of the JLSC. So I would just like some clarification on whether the two attorneys of at least 7 years experience, whether it would be persons within who are employed by the JLSC within the state sector, like state attorneys, who can be recommended to the minister to serve on this board, or whether there would be a recruitment process by the JLSC who would then, and I'm not sure how that would work, that the JLSC could, is either the JLSC recruits and appoints someone, or I don't know, to advise the minister as to who, if this person is not already employed in the state sector. I think that's a little bit clumsy and needs to be clarified a little bit there. I do have, Senator John raised the issue of the immunity given to the board, but I've also noticed that there's immunity for CEO and staff as well, and that the standards set in order for them to not benefit from this immunity contained in the Act is gross negligence, which is a very high standard. Now, as Senator Sagram Singh Suklal pointed out, the Honourable Minister, there are other laws which deal with the actions that could be taken against a director or a CEO, chairman, and so on when it comes to their failing to do their duties under the Companies Act and all of that. So then why is it necessary for immunity to be included in a piece of legislation? I have not seen that in other pieces of legislation, immunity to a state board or immunity even to staff and employed by a board, save and except in situations of gross negligence. So if there's a legitimate reason why they feel that it is necessary to put that there, if it is in compliance with some requirement or standards somewhere internationally that's set, one of the things that I find when we are trying to comply with all of these European concepts, I call them, with money laundering, terrorism, economic tax evasion, all of these things, they aren't always an easy fit into what we know to be our regime here and how our laws operate. And so we have to be careful that we're not just importing concepts into our law that don't fit with how our general framework and our constitution and how our common law operates with respect to certain things. So if it is that there's some necessity somewhere to grant immunity, I would like to hear why it is and what is the real thinking behind having that here. So that's my few comments on the composition of the board and their powers. I want to move on to part 7 of the bill and the licensing regime, and I have a couple of suggestions here. For example, there are time frames put into the bill for where a applicant or a licensee must respond to certain things, but where the board is required to, like, for example, give reasons and give notices and so on, there's no time frame. And I find that to be slightly unfair, but also it doesn't bode well, again, for the proper administration. We are asking people to come here and invest a lot of money because operators are also responsible, like, let's say, for example, infrastructural development of the zone and so on. If under Part 7, the board is for example, considering revoking the license of an operator, and they have to give them an opportunity to respond. There's a time-specific period for the operator to respond to the concerns of the board, but there's no time specification for the board to, for example, give its reasons and all of that. And of course, these have implications because people may wish to approach the court. You cannot approach the court for a judicial review or anything like that unless you have the reasons set out in writing. And so you don't want to have a situation where it is an open-ended requirement on the part of the board, and they can take anywhere from 14 days to 14 months to provide you with those things. Under the Judicial Review Act, there's a provision whereby you can apply for a statement of reasons from any public authority. So I don't see a difficulty with including that same time frame here into what is available under the Judicial Review Act. I think it's section 12 or 13, somewhere around there. I'll check it. But I would propose an amendment to all of those sections that ask the board to provide reasons and so on, to do so within the same time frame. Again, the creation of that level of certainty really will boost confidence of potential investors in how this board will operate and conduct its affairs, because you have to make this thing attractive to them, right? And tax concessions alone aren't enough to make this thing attractive to people who you want to come and invest. So the other thing that I have a concern about is clause 44, specifically, that deals with the powers that the board can, that the authority can, or the actions that they can take. Section 44.2 says that in respect of, for the purposes of subsection 1, where, for example, I'm just using the operator's license, but I think it applies across the board, of what they can do, they can issue the notice of non-compliance, they could suspend your license, or they can revoke the license. Now, this basically makes it optional that they could take any action they deem necessary where they determine that there's non-compliance with the act or the terms and conditions of your license. When a board, a state-appointed board, is delegated essentially what is some sort of authority like this, you still have to have due process. And I believe that a graduated approach really should be adopted and mandated. And we see that in other pieces of legislation. In the FIU Act, I know, for example, it is there where they can have an order for someone to cease and desist from operations. You must first issue a notice, you must have a hearing, give the person the opportunity to be heard, and all of these due process requirements are there for a reason. And it goes to the proportionality of the power that you are investing, vesting in this board. So to simply say that for the purposes they may do any one of the three, I find that it would be much more fair and in line with the overall principles of natural justice if you have a graduated approach. It should not be that they can exercise any option and move automatically to revoking of an operator's license. An operator is someone who can have a license for up to 50 years. That is a massive investment. That is a massive investment for someone to put into a zone, and then the authority can just determine that they are not in compliance and automatically invoke that power. Of course, yes, it's subject to, you have the safeguards of going to the court and all of that. But the process itself that the authority adopts really ought to be a graduated one so that you have that due process requirement built into there. That takes me to the issue of inspectors, which deals with, I think, Part 9 of the bill. And I have a difficulty with asking people to enter into a contractual relationship that you are signing away, to some extent, your constitutional rights in exchange for a license. So it is a term and condition, basically, of getting this license that you must agree to the inspectors exercising their powers under this act. And the powers are quite extensive. So I think that some additional safeguards may be necessary with respect to the inspectors. So yes, the authority will have its inspection program, as do other regulators. And the thing is that this authority can conduct inspections with or without notice, and they may or may not have a police officer with them. Under 68.3, the inspector who is conducting it may be accompanied by a police officer, but they do not have to. They can enter the premises without the police officer. The problem with that is that when you go to Section 70, without the police officer, the powers of the inspector are essentially like police powers. They can seize documents, and they can, and not just seize documents, but seize documents to be used in the prosecution of an offense under either this act or any other written law. So you are vesting police powers in these inspectors, and respectfully, I submit that that is is totally disproportionate, and I do not believe that it would withstand the scrutiny of the court if a constitutional matter were to be raised. I do not know that the evidential value of documents seized by an inspector appointed by the commission in the absence of a police officer would again stand up. And of course, these things have to be tested. But we are.
You have 5 more minutes.
Thank you. We are entitled, I think, at this point to raise the concern, because we want, of course, to have we don't want to pass laws that are constantly being challenged and could be challenged, and that, prosecutions and so on can fall through because of some provision that isn't proper. So that ability to seize documents, and then most importantly, I think, is that the inspectors have the power to suspend the activity, to direct the temporary suspension of any activity that they reasonably believe to be in contravention of the act. That is a function of the board, which I just went through, that the board has the power to suspend licenses and so on if they believe that there's a contravention. But they are delegating a very significant power to the inspector, and it remains in force until the board either reverses it, but there's no mandate on the board. I mean, yes, the inspector will provide a report and so on, but there's no mandate for the board to meet, discuss, and review the decision of the inspector within a specific time frame. So the inspector could suspend your license and your operations today within that zone, and you could be waiting 3 months down the road. You don't know if there's a review that's going to happen. You may have to challenge it in judicial review proceedings. But these things aren't... you don't, again, if you're trying to create an environment where people want to invest, you do not want to create things that are so burdensome and tell them, well, the solution is, well, if you don't like it, go to the court. I don't know that people would want to invest in an initiative that requires them to protect themselves all the time with recourse to the court. They should have better due process requirements built into these pieces of legislation. So I'm really concerned that as a condition of your license, you have to sacrifice things like your right to privacy. You are contracting away some of the constitutional provisions included here. The Constitution specifically says that the Parliament shouldn't authorize a commission or a board to compel a person to give evidence. And essentially, when you're mandating that someone must hand over documents to you, and that those documents, and they could be photographed, and that these things could be used in criminal proceedings, that's essentially what you're doing. So Section 5(2)(d) of the Constitution, I think, could be offended to some extent by some of these provisions. Again, I want to just make a suggestion here. When you look at the SEC Act, written notice, reasonable written notice, and what is reasonable, of course, is there, and it's a concept in law, but reasonable written notice must be given before an inspection takes place. An additional protection is that it specifically says in the SEC, in the Securities Act, that a statement made by a person in compliance with the requirements imposed by virtue of the section that deals with inspections will not be used against a person in criminal proceedings. So you protect the person to an extent that, yes, you can conduct your inspections and the commission can make certain determinations based on what a person says voluntarily during an inspection and so on. But that person is shielded, and the constitutionality of that's a constitutional protection, that those statements would not then be used in criminal proceedings. And very quickly, I wanted to say that offenses and penalties, again, when the legislature delegates that type of authority to impose a fine or a power, this is a judicial power. And when a person is allowed to opt out of a criminal penalty or a criminal sanction by paying an administrative fine and penalty, we want to make sure that, you have certain safeguards in place. I want to suggest, for example, that there be a limit on the amount of fines that the commission can impose, because then, again, you're not giving free rein to the authority, the SEZ authority, to just impose any amount of fine and penalty they want, because, again, fines and penalties are a judicial function. So I think that although the trend now in the regulatory environment that we exist in around the world is that you must allow for administrative fines and penalties, I think that a cap would be a good suggestion. Something that the Securities Act has as well is a schedule of the types of offenses, the actual offenses for which you can select the administrative penalty option as opposed to the criminal sanction. And that, again, it's confined to some of the more like reporting issues and filing of certain things within time frames and all of that. A person can do so, but the more serious offenses, it's not open to them. So I think that that's useful to have the list of the specific offenses and not just any offense created under the act that the board can deal with, because you have a board politically appointed, and this is not to politicize the issue, but you have a board appointed by a government essentially exercising a judicial power, and that strikes at the heart of the separation of powers. So you want to have all the protections that you can essentially have in place before you give the power to a board to act as judge, jury, and executioner. I know my time is up. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Deyalsingh. Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for giving me the opportunity to address the Senate on this important bill. And first I might say, this bill, the Trinidad and Tobago Special Economic Zones Bill 2021, it speaks to really three things: to develop and regulate the special economic zones, also to establish a special economic zone authority, and to actually repeal the existing free zones that existed. 90 clauses, 12 parts, 5 schedules. Much work went into this. So I have to thank and congratulate the minister for putting that effort in. It's very detailed, and I was happy she said that the consultation was made with persons locally, business entities, the OECD, and also trying to, also the fact that the World Bank had an input in a report that they had given before. So it's some time coming. I think since 2017, it has now come about, and I think hopefully we will have the best practice, and I'd say the minister probably did her homework well. So I would like to say now that, I do have my concerns also, not the fact that, that it is not needed. This definitely is needed. I've seen the fact that the economy is in such a way that anything to revamp it would be something that is welcome. The citizen would welcome it, the business community would welcome it. So we need zones like that. But the fact is, we have to say it's a dream that we have, especially in these COVID times, but we have to know, why did the old zones fail? Why did the free zones fail? I heard a member on the other side, on the government side, saying that some, it was left in abeyance by the opposition. So we have to realize, that and the fact that if it failed before, we have to know, do we have the necessary input? Do we have the necessary things in the legislation, the safeguards that we have? And you see, I really heard the minister made mention of, there was poor performance, inefficient policy frameworks, weak institution, weak legal regulation frameworks. So I'm thinking that at least if we have all this in here, we should have something at least we could try and drive to get it. So therefore, when the free zones was established in 1988, it had the same positive vibes, the same thing for the country looking to diversify, and it was there. So we failed. I mean, members, I sure would have realized that we had failed on both sides. Only 15 zones existed up till recently. And then, so the question, sir, is how much taxpayers' money went into these zones, a failed thing? And we cannot afford, as Senator Richard said, to have a failure continuing with this. Next few years, he said, we'll be asking the same questions. So it is, so we have to see, is it just we were incompetent to run our affairs? Is it that we were the ones who are not able to manage? But no, when I did my research, there was the Foreign Trade Zone Forum in the United States. It was held on the 5th of March, 2019. And they, with all their first world policy, they also had challenges. And they also said when somebody applies, it takes a year before they get through. And they were now hoping to bring it down to a month. So when I heard that, it was comforting to know it's just not just Trinidad was in this place, but the USA, who actually looked to get these trade zones on board since, I think, 1938. So it's there. And, government, I think, has to pursue this activity of trying to revamp the system, which worldwide we see it's increasing. So if you find that from 5 years now, it's increasing from 4,000 to 5,400 zones, obviously there's a push globally fit. But I wonder sometimes whose interest it serves. Because you see, sir, I have, when you're hearing the persons saying certain things about it, the European Union spoke out about certain trade activities which they offered concern. Now, our Attorney General has passed a lot of laws in terms of the, foreign money laundering. But I wonder sometimes, is these new zones, the push for it, could it be a way of certain business elites lobbying governments to bring this in, to at least have the same facility to launder money, have those illicit trade practices? And this is a worry that I have, that we could be now negating the effects of the Attorney General and those persons who passed these laws. And it's not just myself having this sort of a feeling. And I'd like you, if I allow me, to read into the Hansard, the free trade zones are havens for illicit trade. It was a media release by the Trinidad and Tobago Manufacturers Association, where they actually, in that release on March the 2nd, 2021, they actually see that they have to, it could be like havens for illicit trade, and wonders whether customs had sufficient oversight, whether goods are ever inspected. And they actually warned about these zones, trading in illegal wildlife trade. And we know Venezuela, we had things coming in with wildlife trade and arms trafficking. We have that problem in Trinidad and Tobago already. I mean, thank God we got some border patrol. But you see, those are problems we have to see. If we are now opening the doorway, opening a Pandora box, where we would be having these little zones all over, where they can bring in stuff, they can bring in things, and we wouldn't have the oversight. So it might be making the life of the Minister of National Security difficult if you have these little satellite zones all over, and they may be having arms, ammunition, all the illicit trade are there. It's making it difficult. So the scrutiny is vital. The scrutiny is very vital. And the operators, and the inspectors, and the functions of the authority in trying to look at these infractions. So I just want to read in again the Daily Express. TTMA encouraged after 2 owners charged, and this was in the October 21st, 2021. They praised the Ministry of Trade and the Police Service for actually getting some illicit stuff in some, I think, some groceries. But they said also, again, in this recent article, they said it is imperative that companies in free zones do not become cleaning houses for illicit products. So my take is, sir, is we have the minister saying that the OECD's document and their input was garnered for the preparation of this, which is something I'm very pleased that she did that. Because I just want to make mention of the OECD report 2018, where governance frameworks to counter illicit trade, they mentioned that globalization and free trade are strong drivers in economic growth, which we need. They have also opened up new opportunities for illicit trade activities, which we have mentioned before. Criminal networks benefit from these opportunities at the expense of public safety, human rights, legitimate business, activity, sustainable environmental resources. Consumers rely on the effective institutions and law enforcement to protect them from the risk of illicit goods. Businesses also rely on them to counter and deter illicit markets. And therefore, illicit trade is, they mention also may ultimately undermine the rule of law and citizens' trust in government. So whatever we open up to, we have to be careful. We have to be careful. I'm saying that, we are not causing a situation to develop where we will regret later on in terms of money laundering and whatnot. Also, some members mentioned the fact that we are competing with Panama, which has a gateway between the Atlantic Pacific Ocean. Panama, who has been there for years. But remember, Panama also, it's a history of having money laundering haven. So we have to be careful we are not getting pulled into something. Now, I also mentioned the fact that recently in Barbados, it was the Barbados Today newspaper also said on November the 10th, 2021, that free zones are coming to Barbados. So even Barbados now we have to compete with. So look at our problem here. Trinidad has crime, some corruption problems, ease of doing business problems, and now if we are looking at the gateway of the Americas, and people can say, okay, it's South America, it could come here. Barbados is a few miles away. So we really, really have to get our act together in terms of not creating something that we would regret. I just want to go on to the piece of legislation here. I would want to look at the powers of the authority. And looking at Clause 6, where it mentioned that, the authorities issue guidelines, directions, and whatnot for the policy, for the running of the zones, and also they are responsible for investigating the applicants. Now, this is very difficult because sometimes you may have applicants coming in from China, different countries, there's a language problem. How are they going to get the resources or the means to do that? So that is difficulty and costly. They also have to grant and set terms of conditions of licensing. So they have to make sure that they are fair and proportionate, and persons may not cry any sort of preferential treatment. They have to also take enforcement measures in the event of any non-compliance with the breach. And again, I welcome those enforcement measures that we have seen later in the bill. And they have to also ensure that any sort of registrants are put in a public list, which is very, very necessary, because that public list, it's something that other persons setting up free zones could look at our list. And I'm suggesting if we even refuse persons in our free zone or have a reason to struck them off or say, look, you're not welcome here anymore, those persons should be put on that list where other organizations, Barbados, if they want to get somebody, they would say, well, look, these people had a bad result in another country. And the OECD should be also given that list to have a warning to other persons who may not be able to have the capacity to do that investigative means that we are putting on the authority. When I look at Clause 7, also, when you looked at the composition of the board, a few members mentioned that, they had reservations of the persons on the board. And I also looked at the persons who are needed, the 6 persons and different business and finance, information technology. And, again, looking at the poor outcomes in some of those free zones, it is necessary, I think, to have probably somebody with an OSHA rep, I think, or either serving in Section 66, where they can go in with the inspectors to look at their place. So somebody from OSHA is needed in this. And Section 66 mentioned the inspectors coming in and inspecting the place and the powers. But I'm thinking it shouldn't be just one inspector. It should have an inspection team where you have a OSHA representative, a UDA representative going in to inspect to see if there are breaches. Because you see, also, Trinidad is a place where you have levels of corruption leveled against certain instances. Now, if the inspector has that power, do we have anything in place to ensure that he would not be somehow bribed into giving a good report, a favorable report? Would they be held under the Integrity Commission also? Because that's that job. It's an important job really to look and to go. And we have to ensure that they go in, I rather they go in as a team, which is a little more difficult to control one individual than just one. So I look at the appointments to the board, and I see the two appointees will have to be the attorneys, and this I don't see the need for two. Now, granted, the authority has the provision where they can make recommendations to the minister. So they may need to have attorneys to draft new law to keep up with the time with the evolving situation to actually give some sort of guidance to the minister that we want certain things changed. But I think the two attorneys might be overkill. I think we may need to look at the fact that the terms of the appointments I had some problems with also. When I looked at the section 7.4b, where the A and B actually, where they looked at the terms of appointment, the chairman and 3 other members shall be appointed for a term of 4 years. Why 4 years? Why don't bring it 3 years? In case they are not performing, we can get them out. So we have to have a way of looking at the chairman, looking at the board. When they're making report, have some way of assessing them. Are they getting the zones to work? Are they going in some sort of, with the funds, doing some sort of expenditure that persons out there are comfortable with? I say 3 years. Also the fact that the deputy chairman and 2 other members shall be appointed for a term of 3 years. So you have here, the chairman is 4 years, the chairman and 3 members, 4 years, the deputy chairman and 2 other members, term of 3 years, and 3 members shall be appointed for 2 years. If I have a member appointed 2 years, I'll feel, but why am I only getting 2 years? Is it that I am somehow discriminated against? I think we should all give everyone appointment for 3 years. Now, I understand staggering of the boards is important, but then we will put the level on the minister to ensure that you have people chosen in time, 1. 2, you can also hire out the old board to come in to give advice on the transition period. So there's not a need to stagger these boards. So also, the minister has the power to put the terms and conditions of appointment. So any member of the board, people may say she couldn't give favorable appointments to certain persons. So probably, just as how she has the requirement to publish in the Gazette notice the members of the board, we should get a public disclosure on any sort of a contract made by these members also. When I looked at the fact that the section 5, so when I looked at the functions of the authority, and I said that it's really function to formulate the policy of the minister and the government that is in power, which all well and good. They designate the zones, and also section 5E looked to review and assess the performances of all zones. I think it's like himself judging himself. Because you see, if I am in charge of a pupil, I may give a favorable report because I will go to the minister and say, you did a poor assessment in the first place. So there should be some other factor, some NGO, some other persons coming in to help that assessment. And actually, there are certain NGOs where are linked to the University of Sheffield and Oxford, where they actually try to look at sweatshops and the electronic, making of electronic in these areas. You could get these persons to come in and help in a judging of the activity also, not just the authority judging themselves. I mean, they would have their sheet, but it has to be some other methods. Given the codes of practice is excellent, I'm saying, but we have to know the codes have to be very important. Developing the infrastructure, again, it is mentioned to develop modern infrastructure required to attract foreign investment. So I guess the IT department and the ministry may also have to come into that. Development local communities. We have to be a little careful for that because you're giving them the power to develop local communities. In the past, I've heard people in the opposition or when the government was in the opposition say that certain state enterprises have a preferential for certain voters of the party in power. We don't want people to now come and tell these authority members, oh, you're only developing the communities that are beneficial to the government here. So I think you're putting them in that position where people could point fingers at them. When I look at 5.2c, to develop the human resources, including the related to recruitment, promotion, training, development, performance assessment, conditions of work. This is very important. And you see, disciplinary and termination. So the conditions of work, the conditions of employees, all these are important. And I would just like, sir, if you allow me to just read into this, the certain problems that were encountered, certain problems were encountered in other jurisdictions. I remember when I was in Jamaica in 1988, there was, when I left there, they had persons striking in their zones because of the practice where they thought they were being somehow discriminated against, somehow being overworked. We don't want foreigners to come here and exploit our workers, and master they might return. So looking at 5.2e, we have to look, there are plenty pieces of legislation out there, and one I just want to quote, Workers' Rights and Wrongs Fair Trade Zones in the Labor in the Americas, June 19, 2017. They looked at the Dominican Republic when the free zones left. It left about 43,000 people in the garment industry unemployed. And you see, we have to be careful that we are not setting up individuals that when you are in these zones and you have a job and they just pull out because of probably they're looking at unionization coming in or a better deal else when they just leave. What will happen to those workers? So part of that agreement should also be counseling to those workers to teach them how to manage their money, to teach them in case there's job loss, how you can deal with any sort of underlying depression that could occur. There are instances where some of those zones led to sexual exploitation. So we really need the Senator Jennifer Batiste, who was here before, did a beautiful piece of law on sexual discrimination. We need to get that going. So therefore we can now, any sort of persons there are being exploited, we would be able to somehow, get them within the ambit of the law. I also make mention of the fact that I must say something. Those zones typically hire females, and I don't think there should be gender discrimination. So somehow, Madam Minister, I would have to say that if a man wants a job in a factory there, we should somehow ensure that he would also be employed, because if you look at the literature, it speaks a lot of females there and female problems and sexual exploitation. Some people even had to get pregnancy tests before they could have gotten jobs. It reached to that level. What I'd like to say also, sir, is that the fact that I have a little concern where the authority, has the authority to actually develop the finance and property and all these things, given them permission to actually divest their money. Now, in the past, we have state board statutory companies that lost money. Taxpayers were angry about it, and so two things here coming out of this. I wouldn't like to see, as Senator Lutchmedial mentioned, the fact that we shouldn't have any indemnity to these members, so they have to perform to the best of their abilities. And two, any sort of investment they're doing should be checked with the minister. Is it a good investment? People may say they are buying somewhere, renting a property. All sorts of allegations could be made. So to prevent any sort of this, I caution that investment. Get their money from the normal zones and the normal zone activities. But we have to be cautious in what these state boards are allowed to do with public money, especially if they don't have that level of accountability. I would like to look at the fact that they have the power to actually enforce certain legislations. They have the power to have the inspectors on board, and I think that piece of legislation there with the inspectors is very, very important. When I looked at Part 9. I think Section 66 onwards, that speaks to the inspectors, and I mentioned it should be inspection teams, which I would rather. And also, the fact is, the other mention I would make, sir, is the operators. When I'm looking at the operators, the license, you're giving somebody a license for 50 years. I find that's, granted, they are putting down their money there, but I heard Senator Deyalsingh mention we might be bringing in the Chinese, what I should say, the Chinese dragon, or the Chinese with some of their bad effects that was known globally. Are we now going to tie in our country with that 50-year? And suppose another administration comes on board and does not like this, any sort of dealings with the Chinese. I think having that 50-year period is too long. We should somehow see if we could reduce that. I make mention of the fact, sir, that also the fact that the authority has the power to actually set up zones elsewhere and look for the zones. Again, we need the input of the EMA. Should the EMA be a member of the, put a member there also to look at our environmental standards and requirements, just to ensure what we are going to set up, what they are going to set up is above board. And you see, it also mentioned here that, no property, I'm looking at, it mentioned that no property, this is in Section 30, where you are looking at the designation of the special zones, the geographical areas. You see, the authority has the power to actually, with the consent of an owner, buy that property or whatnot. But we have to also appreciate that some people may not like the setting up of our industrial estate close to them. We had instances in I think it was in the industrial estate in Macoya, where people complained of sulfur rain and all these things. So we have to be also cognizant of the fact they should not just with the EMA, but the input of the neighboring areas. Do you want a zone in that area to prevent any sort of protests, which we tend to have in this country from time to time? So that is important, that they have that input from the persons around. Also, we looked at the geographical zones. And Senator Tibble made mention of the fact that, the water, the power, the telecommunications, all that will be going into these zones. And people around these zones may be having challenges to get those basic things. So instead of having a disparity where citizens may say, well, those are special foreigners coming here to get the special treatment. Look how the road is good, they get water extra. We need probably to fix the surrounding areas first. Deal with the surrounding areas before you go now and set up that thing. Because again, even if you have one of those zones set up, it'll be embarrassing if foreigners come here and they drive into the zones, they are driving down to major potholes, and it doesn't look too nice for our country. So what I'm looking at, sir, is also the fact that the authority in Section 36 has the provision looking at the facilities to see if they have medical, occupational safety, health customs, which is excellent. I don't want an industry to be...
Senator, you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you, sir. I don't want an industry to set up and next minute some industrial accident occur, you don't have any medicinal services close by. So all these are excellent things worked into this bill. As I mentioned before, I don't like the operator's license, 50 years. The fact is, I also make mention to the fact that you have, sir, the authority actually, people who breach, who are actually the enforcement action. If enforcement action is taken into account, the authority shall cause notice of the suspension of the enterprise license on a single zone enterprise to be published in 2 daily newspapers and also on the authority website. And I'm thinking we have to get that link onto OECD so they can also reciprocate also. I sometimes in the medical board, when we had to look at a doctor's pass, we couldn't even find out about one single doctor who was working somewhere if he was struck out in that jurisdiction unless we had that input from the other medical board. So they are in a great difficulties if they have to be looking at these, the background of these zones, especially the persons coming in may be coming in with the intention to launder money or to get away from the system, as was mentioned by the TTMA in their release. The fact that we have the schedules also having the aspect where they cater for micro, small to medium, large business. This is excellent because it shows that we are trying to develop these small things. All these are excellent things in this piece of legislation. So my really concern was the fact that would we be bringing in people here that, would be coming to really exploit our situation, coming in here to give us goods and services that, they're coming in here to actually substandard stuff. And we realize there's a trade in narcotics. Sometimes you go out and even medicine. Sometimes there was a case where people would have got augmented antibiotics, very expensive, but there was a imitation one out there, and the drug reps were aware of it. I remember once a patient, we couldn't get petadine, which is a narcotic, a morphine injection for a patient, and one of my patients told me there is a so-called drug dealer who sells and supplies petadine tablets. So it's out there already. We already have difficulties out there in terms of looking at what's coming in, the trade, the illegal trade. We have already seen that it's challenging. Bringing in these things here, we have to be careful. And the OECD also alerted us to a new danger recently where they said postal and courier streams also deliver things into our country. We have seen drugs coming in here via the courier service. So again, the minister may have to ensure, or the authorities may have to ensure that, any sort of intermediaries bringing in things would be checked properly. So those zones need to be effectively managed by security. It needs to be effectively managed by the customs divisions, to at least anybody entering these zones would not be tempted to get away with bringing out stuff that should not be out there. And as I say, here, so the AG, I'm happy is here, and I'm thinking, we have a lot of conventions, the UN Single Convention on Narcotics and Drug Supplies, we have the Council of European Convention, and all these are conventions are there, the Convention of Psychotropic Substances. I think our AG will ensure that we get these conventions ratified into law to help us at least be able to have legislation in place to at least counter any sort of illicit effects. So I thank you, Madam, for bringing this legislation. It is needed, but we need a guide, the safeguards. Thank you.
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, before beginning my contribution to this very important and significant piece of legislation, may I follow in the footsteps of many of my colleagues who spoke before me by offering my sincerest congratulations to the people of Tobago for choosing new leaders to help chart a course towards a future for sustainable opportunities and transformation for all in Tobago. In particular, congratulations go out to Watson Duke, Farley Augustine, and all members and supporters of the Progressive Democratic Patriots on your resounding victory in the December 2021 THA elections. May God richly bless you all in your endeavors as you work towards and work together to serve the best interests of the people of Tobago and Trinidad. Mr. Vice President, I know you are a Tobagonian yourself. And may I inform you, I have just received a communication from the Elections and Boundaries Commission. It's a press release stating that at the last count, it was 14 electoral districts in favor of the PDP and one singular unitary seat for the outgoing PNM. This is what we call in Trinidad and Tobago political boah that the PNM has experienced in Tobago. Mr. Vice President, let me deal with the matter that is before us. Mr. Vice President, this bill that is before us today has had many, well, the policy leading up to this bill has been around for several years. I think my colleague Sagram Singh did mention earlier incarnations of this bill. But what is extremely significant, Mr. Vice President, is that we have been hearing about different manifestations of these efforts. And today we deal with a bill entitled the Trinidad and Tobago Special Economic Zones Bill 2021. Mr. Vice President, you know Trinidad and Tobago has been struggling for the last 58 years to really promote the non-energy export sector. And of course, this effort that we are dealing with today, again, is designed to promote the non-energy sector, and particularly the non-energy export sector. So what we are being told by the policymakers in this piece of legislation is that the legislation is designed to promote exports, to attract foreign direct investment, to promote economic growth, to generate employment, productive employment, and to ensure diversification and transformation. And Mr. Vice President, when you go to the 2016 budget, you will see mention made of the special economic zones in terms of a policy. And the policy only took manifestation, I understand, in 2019. And in 2021, as we head towards the season of goodwill and peace upon all men and women, we are now dealing with the translation of this policy into legislative clothing. The first thing I'd like to say, Mr. Vice President, it is unfortunate that my colleague, Senator Sagram Singh, spent some time dealing with the ILO and the importance of labor.
Senator Mark, it's Minister in the Ministry of the Attorney General, so we use the proper titles.
Thank you very much for guiding me, Mr. Vice President. The Minister in the Ministry of the Office of the Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs made reference to the ILO and how the government is committed to labor and ILO standards, among other things. Mr. Vice President, I have been in consultation with JTOM, the Joint Trade Union Movement. I have been in contact with the National Trade Union Center. And those two federations, along with FITOWN, were never consulted by this government on this measure that will impact on employment relations, that will impact on labor relations. So there is an inescapable imperative and necessity for the government to engage labor in this piece of legislation. But their disrespect, not only for the people of Tobago, but for the labor movement and the laboring classes, are manifested in what we have before us. Mr. Vice President, I would like to say from the outset that there are two tales of different regulatory authorities that the minister would need to clear up for us as we move along. If we are talking about attracting foreign direct investment, there must be a sensitivity to political intervention and political influence in the economic situation that these zones are going to be located and placed in. Mr. Vice President, I have looked through this bill, and on no fewer than 38 times, it may be less, but between 30 and 38 times, the minister is involved. The minister is involved. The minister's hands are involved. How can you have a bill that is seeking to attract foreign direct investment and the minister is so integrally involved in this matter? This is ministerial dictatorship that is being manifested here. And Mr. Vice President, I want to serve notice on you and this honorable house that I have a slew of amendments which I shall be circulating in due course to bring some sanity to this madness that we have before us. Mr. Vice President, in whose interests is this bill being promoted, being peddled, being advanced? Is it in the interest of the workers? Is it in the interest of the people? Is it in the interest of the economy? Well, if it is in the interest of the workers, they are not represented on the authority in accordance with the provision currently before us or the clause that is before us. And Mr. Vice President, if I may, I want to deal immediately with the absence of any labor representation in Clause 7 of this bill. Clause 7 is very clear as to the composition. There's no representation from labor. There's no representation from the private sector in this bill. So, Mr. Vice President, we want to ensure that balance is brought to this authority if this thing is to work. So we want to serve notice that these are amendments that we are going to propose. Now, Mr. Vice President, if you go to the Minister of Finance 2022 budget statement, you will see where the Minister of Finance made it very clear in his budget statement that this legislation that we are dealing with today is designed to arrive at what is called compliance with the requirements of the Global Forum and the European Union. And to do that, the government has had to repeal the Free Zones Act in an effort to establish this new regime known as the Special Economic Zones Act or Bill. And in that bill, there is an authority that will be responsible for formulating standards, reviewing and assessing performance of all these SEZs, formulating standards and prescribing codes of practice to be observed by operators in the economic zones, facilitating and enabling environment in areas designated as special economic zones, developing the modern infrastructure required to attract foreign direct investment and stimulating domestic investment, and promoting economic development in local communities and advancing further diversification of the economy. So, Mr. Vice President, we are seeing two aspects of the legislation. One aspect tells us that the bill is being driven by foreign interests. So, Global Forum and the European Union have forced the government to repeal, through this piece of legislation, the Free Zones Act. And the government has collapsed a number of areas that were traditionally under what is called ETEC, which is a state-owned entity, and has now sought to bring these things under this Special Economic Zones Act. So we're talking about, Mr. Vice President, the interests of internal forces that will, in fact, feature prominently in this measure. As I said, Mr. Vice President, looming very large and literally in charge of this process is the presence of the minister acting on behalf of the political directorate. Mr. Vice President, when you go to the licensing regime in this bill, under the operator's license arrangement, under the Special Economic Zone Enterprise license regime, under the Special Zone Enterprise license regime, the minister is providing, Mr. Vice President, approval for the issuing of licenses. The minister is also involved in renewing licenses. The minister is also involved in revoking licenses. The minister is large and in charge. And we don't want that in this piece of legislation. Let the authority have the authority or the power to deal with these matters, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, in the legislation, if you go to the section that deals with staffing, there are some issues in the staffing of this authority that is of some concern to us, and that deals with the employment of workers on contract, and also when tasks are to be executed, we are seeing the contractual arrangements being put in place. So we have some reservations about this approach to engaging workers and others on a contractual basis, given the experiences we have had. Mr. Vice President, when you go to the financial provisions of the legislation, we are seeing where the government is proposing, or the minister is proposing, the power of this authority to borrow money. So they have the power to borrow money, Mr. Vice President. They have the power to invest monies into securities under the Securities Act. These are times, Mr. Vice President, where we want to have proper checks and balances when organizations or institutions or the authority that we are dealing with have given or been given that kind of power. We must have checks and balances to address these matters, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I've also seen under financial provisions a section that have me a bit disturbed, and I wish to draw it to your attention. Mr. Vice President, if you go to clause 26 of the legislation, you will see where, Mr. Vice President, in clause 26, the Auditor General is given the power to audit the accounts in accordance with our Constitution of this authority. But we are seeing in clause 26, subclause 5, 4 and 5, some developments that are disturbing. And we want clarification on those areas that are here in clauses 4 and 5 of subclauses 4 and 5 of clause 26. And I quote, Mr. Vice President, nothing in this section precludes the Auditor General or an auditor engaged by the board or the minister from performing a management or comprehensive audit of the activities of the authorities. That's fine, of the authority. However, it goes on in sub 5 of clause 26 to say, and I quote, the fees and expenses of the Auditor General with respect to audits shall be paid by the authority. Now, Mr. Vice President, I do not know if I've missed something, but I need to understand whether in our Constitution and under the Exchequer and Audit Act, the auditor has the ability to charge fees when they are performing a public function under the Constitution. I am seeing this being inserted in this law, this bill, and I'm very disturbed about it. So we need to clarify this matter and to really get from the government, is this a new provision, Mr. Vice President, that is being inserted? And if that is so, do we need to amend the Constitution or the Audit and Exchange, Audit and Exchequer Act in order to give the auditor this new function? It appears to be new to me because I've been looking at legislation for several years, and I cannot recall seeing a provision that allows the Auditor General to charge fees in this particular situation. So I need to get some clarification on this matter, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, we would like the Honorable Minister to explain to us, because when we go to clause 43 of this act, and Mr. Vice President, I'm dealing specifically with what is called operators and the issuing of licenses. I would like to ask the minister, through you, when she's winding up, why the discrimination, Mr. Vice President, in the duration of the licenses? Why are we giving an operator a license for 50 years, but somebody who is operating a special economic zone enterprise license is being given 5 years? Why the discrimination? Why this huge disparity between 50 years and 5 years? So we want to bring some balance and equity to this arrangement. So we have an amendment to this 5-year arrangement that the government is seeking to advance. And we are going to propose 25 years at a minimum, or we can go to 50 years at a maximum. But we cannot support a 5-year arrangement. If a foreigner is coming here to invest Mr. Vice President, and you want to attract that foreigner, and that foreigner comes here, and he's seen me an operator is being given 50 years, and I'm coming to invest my capital, and you're telling me I have to come back to you as the authority to renew my license every 5 years? And the minister, who is a politician, is going to determine whether my license will be renewed or it will be revoked. That cannot be fair. That is not attracting, Mr. Vice President, and offering the necessary incentives to attract foreign investors to our country. So I make it very clear that we need to pay attention to this very important anomaly that I have seen in this piece of legislation. Now, Mr. Vice President, I notice that the people of this country are being asked once again to make huge sacrifices. Huge sacrifices. The minister has not given us, and I'm hoping that when the minister is winding up, Mr. Vice President, she would give us an understanding of what revenues are being lost, given, for instance, the incentives and the benefits that operators are going to enjoy in Schedule 1 and Schedule 2. Mr. Vice President, these enterprises that are going to be in these zones, whether they be operators, whether they be SEZs, or single zone enterprises, Mr. Vice President, they are going to enjoy huge benefits. And I know that the Minister of Public Administration indicated in her contribution that they are going to come with a taxation regime to indicate what is what, how much they will get. But, Mr. Vice President, I have to go with what is before us today. And before us today, if you are an operator, Mr. Vice President, you are entitled to a number of exemptions. You are exempted from property tax. You are exempted from stamp duty. You are exempted from import duties. Mr. Vice President, in Schedule 2, under various types of SEZs, whether it is Freeport, Mr. Vice President, whether it is free trade zone, whether it is an industrial park, Mr. Vice President, whether it is a specialized zone or a development zone, Mr. Vice President, you are going to be enjoying zero-rated VAT, Mr. Vice President. You are going to be enjoying customs duty on everything that you import, capital goods, spare parts, raw material, stock in trade. You are going to be also enjoying, Mr. Vice President, reduced corporation tax. We don't know how much it will be reduced by, Mr. Vice President. And most egregious is that you are going to be exempt from property tax. But the government is seeking to impose property tax on the ordinary people of this country. But you are going to bring investors here. You're going to attract local domestic investors, and you're going to allow them, Mr. Vice President, not to pay any property tax. But you are coming to me and to you and to ordinary people and telling them they must pay tax. So why must I pay tax? And a businessman who is coming to set up in a zone to make profits, you're giving him all these extensions, Mr. Vice President, and exemption, and he would not be paying tax.
Senator, you have 5 more minutes.
Mr. Vice President, I want to make it. You sure, sir? You sure? Okay. Mr. Vice President, in my 5 minutes left, I want to ask the minister, I just mentioned industrial zone. I want to ask the minister to explain to this parliament the role of E-Tech in this matter. I did a research and I came upon a document, and I need the minister to clear the air on this matter. I have a document in my possession, Mr. Vice President, which I can share with you, where in December of 2020, it took effect, Mr. Vice President, on the 23rd of April, 2021, where ETEC has sold the Presal Industrial Park to Ansa Makal for $50 million. This park, Mr. Vice President, has over 75 acres of land. That is 600 lots, Mr. Vice President. How come this government has sold 75 acres of land to Ansa Makal? Look at here, Mr. Vice President, I have it here in this document where they sign ETEC. They sublease it for 99 years. 99 years. And this same company have no problem with business, but have a problem when things are unfair to the people. Mr. Vice President, we have valued this land at over $250 million to $300 million. How can this government sell this land for $50 million? And Mr. Vice President, I want to know, was there competitive bidding? Or was this a sole selected arrangement? This falls under industrial park. It is called the Presal Industrial Park. And Mr. Vice President, as I told you, under the legislation that I have before me, that we are debating, there is provision to give the industrial park a lot of incentives. So if you are going to give industrial parks incentives, you must come and tell this country, why did you give 75 acres of land in Presal Industrial Park to Ansa Makal? It is coming under something called Sinclair Holdings Limited. I have the document here. And Mr. Vice President, I have the signatures of the people who signed this document. So I am not engaging in small talk here, Mr. Vice President. The signatures are here. So I am saying, Mr. Vice President, the government must come clean. There must be transparency and accountability and good governance in all that they are doing, Mr. Vice President. Don't sell out our assets to your friends and then come here. Do not tell the Parliament that you have sold the Presal Industrial Park for $50 million. That is worth over $250 million. And you came here. I listened to the Minister of Trade and Industry, the Minister of Public Administration, and nobody, Mr. Vice President, indicated to you and to this Honorable Senate that Presal Industrial Park was sold in December of 2020, executed in 2020, registered in April of 2021 to the Ansa Makal Group, coming under something called Sinclair Holdings Limited. I have the documents in my hands, and I want answers on behalf of the people. We are not prepared. We are supporting business, but we are not selling the sellout of our lands to anybody in this country. You must be able to, if you're going to get land, it must be done competitively. It must be done competitively. And I haven't seen it, Mr. Vice President. This was done in secrecy. Nobody knew about it. It never came out in the budget. The minister spoke today, the last time he spoke, and nothing came out, Mr. Vice President. So we call for answers, and we need answers from the government on this particular development that has taken place. And as I said, Mr. Vice President, we have a series of amendments, which, as you have directed, are in writing. We are going to circulate it, and we are going to ensure, Mr. Vice President, that the government account and the government account to this Parliament for this development. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Attorney General, you have 30 minutes.
30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I don't know where to begin, having heard Senator Mark, because there's just so much misinformation, gallery, and scandal, but permit me to do justice to at least responding to the extremely wild allegation that just ended substantively Senator Mark's contribution. Senator Mark started his contribution by talking about political bois. Anybody who is accustomed to the concept of bois and stick fighting in Trinidad knows you have to get into the arena first. To swing the bois, you have to be inside the arena. So I don't know what celebration Senator Mark enjoys. Don't know where the main ridge is, the UNC. Don't feel a single candidate in an election, the UNC. And comes to attempt to swing bois on E-Tech a little while ago. So let me start, Mr. Vice President.
Okay. Senator Mark. Senator Mark.
Mr. Vice President, we have to be with him. I'm not even talking about you. Get involved.
Senator Mark, okay. One thing we cannot tolerate is shouting at the speaker on the floor across the middle of the floor.
My apologies.
Thank you. Continue, Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Bois has a way of getting some people confused. Bois is like taking the TOP.
Okay. Attorney General, one moment. I just spoke. I understand the picong that is going to occur specifically today, but we cannot allow the Senate to fall into disrepute by shouting across the floor at speakers. So if we cannot, Senator Lutchmedial, if we cannot control ourselves, then I'm going to ask that we be silent while the Attorney General is making his contribution. Continue, Attorney General.
Bois. B-O-I-S. French word to mean wood. To get lash, Mr. Vice President, is something that we have to appreciate.
Attorney General, listen, I'm not. Senator Mark, I'm on my legs. So I'm now going to ask that there be silence in the chamber for the remainder of this particular debate. That is my final warning on this. Continue, Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. As I was saying in response to the contribution, it is important to recognize that this country has a lot of positive things about it. Last night and yesterday, and for the last year, we witnessed democracy in action. I, too, would like to congratulate the victors in the THA election yesterday. The island of Tobago has spoken. There is a clear mandate of promises made by the PDP, and now it is without interruption for that to happen. But this is the pleasure of our democracy. This bill, which proposes policy considerations, is legislation. We saw legislation come in the form of this bill, much like we saw legislation to create 15 seats. There was a lot of odium and scandal and allegation as to gerrymandering, etc. But suffice it to say, without going too far, the result of yesterday's performance demonstrates that this government approaches matters with sincerity and with transparency. And on that note, in dealing with the allegation by Senator Mark, screaming at the top of his lungs about an Ansamacale purchase from the E-Tech. E-Tech, of course, is one of the entities involved in certain types of zones fitting within the structure of this bill. I can say this, Mr. Vice President, not only will the Minister of Trade give the details in a short while, there was full transparent process. Ernst & Young, a firm of accountants, engaged in the valuation and procurement of that disposition. Several lands were offloaded in a transparent process. Senator Mark himself alluded to deeds which were registered. Now, registration of sale is an important and material concept because it is not like SIS occupation of land by way of trespass in the same industrial estates where gifts and positions were just simply not monitored. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I notice we have a lot of recommendations coming in context, Mr. Vice President. We have a lot of recommendations coming in relation to what we should or could not do. In relation to the development of special economic zones, permit me to remind the honorable senators present this afternoon, and through you, the national community, we are dealing with the repeal of the free trade zones legislation. That law is now 34 years old nearly. In that particular free zone package, it is important to recognize that we have licenses ad infinitum, meaning there is no position for the ending of licenses in the free trade zone. When we deal with the standards before us today, let's get very specific for a moment. We are dealing with the concept of what we call item 5 of the OECD recommendations. Now, I would like all honorable senators to please pay attention for a moment to this very important overview, which is necessary to consider the bill before us now. Honorable senators, Mr. Vice President, we as a country are being constantly assessed and we operate within a global context. Trinidad and Tobago, as a country that is part of the grouping of countries that prides itself on democracy and transparency, is obliged to meet 4 targets at present. Target number 1, the Financial Action Task Force recommendations and immediate outcomes. Target number 2, the standards for base erosion, profit sharing, transparency and fairness set out by the OECD, which is the G20 and G8. Target number 3, the Global Forum, which deals again with exchange of information for tax purposes on an automatic or request basis. Target number 4, the Mutual Assistance Treaties, the multilateral convention that Trinidad and Tobago must find itself associated with. There are 4 targets. Today, I give notice that the government has been in the subject of conversation with assessors, Financial Action Task Force, Global Forum, OECD, which treats with the European Commission and European Union, and the multilateral treaties. And these targets are constantly moving to the point where they have accelerated targets that are yet to come. Why has this happened? Because Trinidad and Tobago as a country, for a particular period of time, 2010 to 2015, gave certain undertakings which we're bound as a country to have in effect, and which we did not do in that period, which meant that by the time we came to 2017, 2018, and 2019, we were catching up with obligations not yet due. You want me to be less than polite on that? The UNC did not do what it was supposed to do, and crapo smoke all our pipe. Quite simply put. Now, outside of Trinidad and Tobago, people are not interested in UNC and PNM. They're interested in the country. Have you complied with standards or have you not? And in the rest of the world, on this particular bill, permit me, honorable senators, to locate the item now. In the BEPS arrangement, base erosion, profit sharing, and I want to thank Senator West for giving a phenomenal discourse on what that means. That means that the rest of the world wants to make sure that a country can leverage its taxation in a fair and transparent way without another country eroding the base. What does that mean in the Apple context? You don't pay taxes in the United States because you're not registered there, but you don't pay taxes in Ireland because you're registered there, but your mind and management is in the US, so you're effectively avoiding taxation. Now, under the FATF, we have met all of our obligations. We have 2 more obligations to treat with, which are next in line, but we in time. That is recommendations to treat with beneficial ownership and administrative sanctions, and we are dealing with administrative sanctions in this bill in clause 78. But we're on track. On the global forum, where we crashed and burned in the Larry Hawaii approach and in the Kamla Prasad-Bissessar approach, we have 23 items to meet muster on. We have 2 pieces of laws to come because we've been given certain things that have been assessed as of this month to be done. On the BEP side of the equation, we have this item, special economic zones, item 5. We have to deal with something called country-by-country reporting, and we have to deal with preventing tax treaty abuse and making dispute resolution mechanisms more efficient. Therefore, we have country-by-country legislation to come. We also have transfer pricing legislation to come, and we also have dispute resolution mechanisms. We have an Arbitration Act, I can announce, a very excellent piece of law. We are on track because we've done the work. This item today, the SEZ bill, has been proofed by the Global Forum and the European Commission team. What do I mean by that? We had to draft the law, engage in stakeholder consultation, have it approved by the entities that assess us, and they have made certain recommendations which came a couple days ago, and therefore I propose at committee stage to introduce amendments to meet with some of the concerns expressed by honorable senators, but also to meet with some of the concerns expressed by the entities that have assessed us. Effectively, what we're doing is we're moving from the free trade zone environment, and the free trade zone environment is where there are no taxes payable at present, and entities enjoy a license forever with no mechanism to end those licenses other than by way of a repeal and replace of the legislation, which we're doing today. When we treat with the items that the entities are looking at in terms of harmful tax practices, there are effectively 7 items that we must look at, which are in this bill. 1, we need to make sure that our regime meets with the observation. The assessors looked at us and said our regime imposes no or low effective tax rates on income from geographically mobile, financial, and other services activities. This bill does not have a 0% taxation rate. It has a progressive scheme of taxation, which is applied, as Minister West told us and as Minister of Trade told us, in the corporation tax and income tax regimes that are going to come as companions to this. Secondly, we need to ensure that our regime is not ring-fenced from the domestic economy. What does that mean? Senator Timal raised this. Ring-fencing is where you establish an autonomous entity. Let's use the Vatican as an example. We are not legislating a region of Trinidad and Tobago that is outside of the laws of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. We are, therefore, exposing, and you'll see it in the functions and powers, and you'll see it in the context of sections 34 onward, for the zones of operation, the special economic zones enterprises licenses, and for the single operator licenses, we are legislating a licensing regime, 3 types of licenses, operated in a zone where the labor laws work, where the town and country planning laws work, where the regional planners work because they're part of the Town and Country Planning Act. We refer to the Town and Country Planning Act because there is a clause in the Planning and Facilitation Development Act that says wherever you see town and country planning, read it to mean planning and facilitation development. We are therefore in full compliance with the labor laws of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and therefore Senator Mark's big straw man erected to be knocked down to say that JTAM was not consulted is a non-event because all labor laws have to be complied with, including OSHA. Now, the third item that they want us to look at is to ensure that their observation that our regime lacks transparency, for example, details of the regime, its application, etc., adequate regulatory supervision. Let's see how we're addressing that. And I'm staying very high level from the clauses of the bill. Number one, there is a licensing regime. The licensing regime for the zone operator is for 50 years. Now, honorable senators asked the question whether, and Senator Dionarine put it this way, whether there was some confusion because the income to derive from operations aligned with the word operator. Let me make this distinction. This law anticipates the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and you'll see it in the vestings provision in this act, where you vest land in this enterprise, which is the SEZ itself, the authority, the board. We create a statutory authority. It receives the lands which are vested in it. Orders are done, so it's easy to vest and you don't have stamp duty, etc. The zone operator is never going to be the SEZ. The authority will never be an operator. Why? Because it is the licensing entity. The central bank will never be a financial institution under the Central Bank Act. So please, honorable senators, bear in mind, we are not proposing that the authority is going to be an operator. We have operators under a licensing regime for 50 years because you cannot go to a financial institution and raise money without security of tenure to leverage the asset in context of development. In other words, then, the bank wants to have collateral. Now, public and private enterprise, Senator Dylan Remy raised a very important point about the THA. Senator Remy, through you, Mr. Vice President, I just remind that the THA is merely, and unfortunately, and despite the government's best intention, it is still only a statutory authority. What is a statutory authority? WASA, HDC, etc. The government's intention, our stated policy as put into the body of laws which are now before the House of Representatives, are to elevate the THA into an island government. Therefore, the THA, just like the town and country planning, will have its Schedule 4 and Schedule 5 rights, Sections 25 and 26 of the THA Act. They will have to be consulted for land in Tobago, etc., under the provisions of the authority. But we cannot, in this particular piece of law, accept the THA from the Act, because the THA is only a statutory authority. However, the THA maintains its position in law pursuant to its exclusive privileges, which have been judicially determined as to where the THA must be consulted or not. We aspire as a nation to have the THA move away from being a statutory authority and to become an island government entrenched in the Constitution. Mr. Vice President, very importantly, when we look at the effective exchange of information and looking at this licensing regime, which is item 4 of BEPS, we are making sure, hence the 5-year period for the other licenses, that you have to refresh your license every 5 years, because part of our licensing regime involves anti-money laundering, countering financing of terrorism, questionnaires, accounts, and very importantly, at committee stage, we're going to introduce the economic substance requirements. Now, permit me to stick a pin for a moment. In this regime of SEZs, there are two types of SEZs. There are non-intellectual property asset SEZs, and there are intellectual property asset SEZs. This model is intended to bring to life a hybrid model. We do not operationalize the intellectual property side of it yet. We will move an amendment to the bill to say that intellectual property assets are to be treated under the Income Tax Act in such fashion as our laws will allow. Why do we not want intellectual property? It is not to stifle the orange economy or any IP aspects. It is simply because of the Apple experience or the Google experience, which is why another series of amendments will be core economic activity particulars, substantive economic activity particulars, and number of workers. Now, Senator, I believe Senator Thompson IE, Senator Timmel asked, why are we condescending in the virtual world to have actual number of employees? Permit me to address that. The reason why we want actual employees on the site is so that there's real commercial activity and not the Apple experience of 40 people working in Ireland, mine and management in the United States, registered in Ireland, and therefore paying no taxes in no country. So the real and substantial economic nexus has to be by living, breathing bodies attached to research and development. In other words, then, there must be a substantial economic activity. This doesn't mean you can't attend by a virtual meeting. What it means is that there must be real economic activity, and we are not abusing intellectual property rights. So obviously, under the IP regime, we will be looking to exploit, and I'm using this in the commercial realization of copyright and patent laws, we are going to be looking to legitimately exploit the benefit of real and substantial economic activity, because that's what this is about. That's how foreign investment happens, by way of direct and real and tangible investment. We need to make sure that we attend to the regime not encouraging operations that are purely tax-driven to involve no substantial activity. That's the IP exception. And therefore, when we're treating with that, we're going to be adding in, as I said, and I propose the amendments at committee stage, core economic generation activities definition, economic substance test definition, permitted economic activity definition. And the 5-year licensing is to make sure that every 5 years you are ensuring that those licenses are substantial in nature. What we have in the free zones law is a license in perpetuity with no checks and balances, where there has been a harmful tax practice. The UNC knew it was a harmful tax practice, agreed to amend the law, and did absolutely nothing. Coming to cry bois today, but not being present in the arena as a gladiator is required to be. So, Mr. Vice President, when we get to the economic amendments that we're proposing, the licensing regime is for 5 years with resets. Let's deal with the point of inspectors. Senator Lutchmedial raised the issue of inspectors, raised the specter of contracting your rights out. Why do you think we must do that? If we're going to treat with, first of all, the argument that separation of powers is a qualified separation of powers, as CPSAD has been upheld in the Privy Council, if we're dealing with that in the context of Ferguson in the Privy Council, there's a qualified separation of powers. The fact that this board is exercising a quasi-judicial function is the reason why we have 2 attorneys at law by the JLSC. Many senators ask, why 2 attorneys? I don't agree with 2 attorneys. It's 2 attorneys nominated by the JLSC because there are quasi-judicial functions to be exercised, and one would be not enough, particularly if you're going to divide into committees and quorums, like the Law Association has, for instance, in its panels, Panel A, Panel B, Panel C. So the JLSC's nomination is pursuant to meeting the standard in Mirage, the Privy Council decision, which is the interpretation on the Industrial Court. There are umpteen precedents to treat with that. The Industrial Court is built by JLSC nominees. 7 years in this instance.
So you have 5 more minutes.
Not enough time. 7 years as opposed to 10 years, but it is intended to meet that particular muster. When we look to the selection of the boards, because we are looking at the public-private partnership arrangements, the nomination of private sector entities in that board context becomes problematic. Also, too, we already have a board with a quorum of, with a board of 11. A board at 13 and a board at 15 becomes unwieldy. You're looking at 6 persons appointed by the minister with specific criterion, 2 appointed by the JLSC effectively, the Chief Executive Officer who has voting rights, the Board of Inland Revenue which has voting rights, and the Ministry of Planning having voting rights. In other words then, 6 ministerial to 5 public servants. And that's a very good match. Particularly because the economic assessors want to ensure that the government is engaging in the ability of being nimble, because you are required to manage these things with transparency. We have a public register, we have a private register, we have defined terms and conditions. I'll remind Senator Lutchmedial that where no time frame is specified in law, the Interpretation Act prevails. Section 23 of the Interpretation Act says where there's no time specified, it must be done on a very reasonable basis. In other words, then, effectively in a shorter period of time as is there. The provision of indemnities and immunities is not alien to our laws. Look at the Central Bank Act. Look at the Securities Exchange Act. Look at a number of pieces of law. And I'll remind that very recently, we have taken the step to include further amendments to provide immunities and indemnities for gross negligence. Where does gross negligence come from? It comes from the dicta of Mr. Justice Peter Rajkumar, as he then was a High Court judge in the Goodwill case, which sets out what gross negligence is. It is not as high as bad faith in the Central Bank Act. It is not recklessness. It is gross negligence. There's ample judicial anchoring for the prudence of that approach. Mr. Vice President, this law is critically necessary. This law is long overdue from when we decided to do it, but only now able to be brought because the assessors have blessed the law in its final form. The fact that the minister's name is 33 times mentioned works well in the UNC hysteria. It does not work well in the rest of the world. In the rest of the world, checks and balances are the key, which is why we have the Auditor General, which is why we have a registration requirement, which is why we have due process, because wherever your rights are potentially limited by way of consent, variation, refusal, etc., you have Section 14 of the Constitution, you have the Judicial Review Act, and you have your general rights in due process. This is proportionate law with a legitimate aim that goes no further than it must. It is well within the realm of proportionality, whether you want to take it from the Pandey and Gordon limb, or you want to take it from the Surratt limb, or you want to take it from the Ferguson limb, whether you want to take it from the Barry Francis limb. This law is necessary. I end, Mr. Vice President, by urging my colleagues to bear in mind that the government is going to be approaching the Senate for further work. The month of January is expected to be extremely busy because Trinidad and Tobago has a peer review process in the first quarter of next year. And with the peer review assessors having told us on the 4 moving targets, FATF, BEPS, Global Forum, and the treaty, we have an obligation to act with alacrity. I will do my best as the drafter of these laws to give advance notice so that all senators are comfortable with the processes that we must engage in because we're called upon to do this work. Mr. Vice President, I thank you for this opportunity, and I will circulate certain amendments that the government proposes immediately.
Minister of Trade and Industry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. And of course, I can't believe it, but Bois seems to be taking precedence this afternoon. So I would first have to address Papa Bois himself. And Mr. Vice President, Mr. Senator Mark sought to raise a scandal here this afternoon, but I want to give the Senate the assurance that there's absolutely no scandal with regard to this Answer McCall purchase of lands in Presal. Absolutely no scandal. And here I have with me, and I don't have the permission to raise, I didn't see the permission of the Senate, but I can read that and I go to an advertisement in the newspaper, and the Guardian and the Newsday advertised on the 2nd of April 2018 to the 30th of April 2018. I mean, undeveloped lands, undeveloped sites and commercial lands for sale. This is an E-Tech advertisement. Lands, Reform, Presal, Connector Road, Frederick Settlement Extension, Taruba, and of course another commercial building, Duncan Street Complex, with interested parties being asked to contact the following persons to note their interests and to receive the information memorandum on the property assets. Zach Nadur of Ernst & Young Limited and Melanie Tom of Ernst & Young Limited. Mr. Vice President, a purely transparent process by E-Tech. And I can tell you the result of it. And yes, the lands were sold to Answer McCall. And as stipulated within the scope of and I'm going to give you some snippets of the process that followed, as stipulated within the scope of the executed contract between EY and E-Tech, I'm quoting, EY conducted independent valuations on the properties being divested on April 23rd, 2018, and EY provided a draft report on the submitted bids, wherein a total of 29 bids were received. And bids were received with regard to Presal, and I'm not quoting now, I'm looking for the precise point. I think there may have been a total of 9 bids submitted for that particular site, but the highest being Answer McCall Limited. So no scandal at all. And I quote again, as it relates to the Presal site situated at the corner of Coover Road and the Solomon Hochoy Highway, E-Tech recommends that EY close the sale on that property with the top bidder, the land which is approved by E-Tech for industrial use, 78.7 acres, to Answer McCall. No scandal. And I could tell you that I had been advised by Answer McCall since August of 2017 that the land is to establish 2 large-scale warehouse and distribution centers, as well as a new manufacturing venture. This is Answer McCall writing to me, and which would result in the creation of 200 jobs. Now, what could be wrong with 200 jobs, particularly in the area of Presal, creating jobs in the Presal area? What could be wrong with an investment in warehousing and distribution and manufacturing, Senator Mark? It's as if you don't understand the concept of private sector being able to invest. What do you want? Do you want the government to hold on to lands? Where would the private sector invest? So we understand the basis of the relationship between government and the private sector, and we're very satisfied, and I'm sure the population is now satisfied that this was a fully transparent process, and there was no giveaway, no scandal at all. So, Senator Mark, you wasted a few minutes of my time. So, Mr. Vice President, I want to thank sincerely the Honourable AG for clearing up all of the legislative issues, and again to thank the CPC and the Ministry of Trade and Industry officials who were involved in the drafting of this 90-clause legislation over the last 2 years. Very, very important, and I know that this debate has been a rich one, and again, I want to thank all of those who cited this particular bill as being one of immense importance. Senator Deyalsingh, Senator Dylan Remy, in fact, many of the senators on the independent bench, and of course my colleagues as well, would have cited the importance of this bill and again, demonstrating an understanding of the need for Trinidad and Tobago to implement additional measures aimed at attracting investment and promoting economic diversification, particularly at this time as we talk a lot about economic transformation. This is about big business. This is about small business. This is about advancing the cause of micro businesses, small businesses, large businesses, rural businesses, urban businesses, and really it is about the development of Trinidad and Tobago. It is the development of the people of Trinidad and Tobago who would have an opportunity to participate in this particular venture. So again, I think there may have been some mistakes with the institutional arrangement. I got the sense that there was not clarity in the minds of everyone. And I just want to very simply say, and again, this is for the benefit of the public, that the bill provides the legislative framework for this licensing regime for operators, SEZ enterprises, single zone enterprises. And this new institutional framework will comprise an SEZ authority with clear functions and powers as set out in clauses 5 and 6. And basically, this SEZ authority will be the regulator. That's their job. The SEZ authority is not going to be an operator. The SEZ authority is a regulator. The SEZ operators will be responsible for the physical development and management of zones. In other words, they would be like a landlord. They would be, and when I say public, it's probably like an e-tech. Or when I say private, it could be any other private institution, and there are many out there who are developing lands and encouraging businesses to participate within their enterprise. The SSE enterprises will be the tenants in the zone, tenants within the zone owned by the landlords, and the single zone enterprises, which will be approved by the authority, and to engage in any of the permitted activities which are set out in Schedule 3 of the bill, and these will be standalone entities without an operator. So there's no operator controlling a single zone enterprise. They are operating on their own. Yes? So, and again, we made the clarity as well, the operator can be a public body, private body, or public-private partnership. And Senator Timon had noted that the definition of a private body includes an unincorporated entity. And from a policy standpoint, the bill seeks to allow a wide range of persons and entities to invest and participate in the development of zones, so that all bodies, and we talked about micro businesses, and many of them are not incorporated. So it's not just about public bodies at all. All bodies, all persons, including an unincorporated entity seeking to become an operator or being an entity within a zone, will have to meet, of course, the eligibility criteria as set out in Schedule 4, as well as to satisfy all of the detailed financial and other criteria that have been listed at Clause 35. And of course, they will all, public or private, have to ensure that they complete the AML, CFT, PF risk assessment, and so on. So we know what the rationale is. I think it has been well sounded in the debate. I mean, this is about global trend and best practice. Today, there are a number of modern, efficient economic zones found across the Americas, Europe, Asia, Middle East, Africa. And why should we be left behind, especially when we have a regime that has not been functioning? And of course, this also is about the achieving national development goals. And one of the pillars of the National Development Strategy, Vision 2030, is building competitive businesses. And of course, this is about establishing technology parks, building centers of excellence, developing new and enhanced suites of incentives, developing existing economic sectors, supporting new and emerging sectors. So it's well in line with our Vision 2030. Not only that, but also our roadmap to recovery, which goes into specific details about some of the sectors that we must pay attention to. And again, as AG spoke at length to, this is about meeting international obligations. And there's no need for me to go into further details about that. Senator Thompson I had raised the whole question about the objects clause and so on. There are clear objectives for this SEZ regime, which I spoke of, and which again the AG spoke of, and all of my colleagues on this side in their presentation. So it's about expanding the country's revenue base by advancing diversification of the economy. Most important, diversification, enhancing the revenue base. It's about creating that enabling environment for the existing and emerging businesses and clusters in these particular areas, which we are now going to be designating special economic zones. It's about the development of modern infrastructure, which required to attract foreign direct investment, local investment as well, and exports, key. It's about encouraging and enhancing private sector participation in the economy. And it's about promoting economic development, not only in the urban areas, but also in local communities as well, in the development zones that we talked about. So all of these objectives are in line with the rationale, and there was therefore in our mind, Senator I, no need for an objects clause, which is, and this is in keeping with our very contemporary mode of legislative drafting. It's very clear what the objectives are, and there's no need to recite these objectives in an objects clause. And I hope this satisfies you, Senator Thompson. I hear, and I really do admire the fact that you did so much work in looking at the Bahamas legislation, and also I think it was the Jamaica legislation, and we thank you for that. But continuing to other responses raised, other than what the AG would have highlighted already. And Senator Mark, I really don't understand why you would have an issue with incentives. That's the only way we're going to attract foreign and local investment. This is a very competitive global environment, and we're only going to be able to do it if we can differentiate ourselves. And as it is with so many SEZ zones set up across the globe, we have to be in line with the regime, and we must offer incentives. I can't understand what you would have against that, but I leave that right there. Again, I was disappointed with some of the contributions by those in the on the opposition side. But again, on the other hand, I have to say that Senator Lutchmedial did give a good suggestion regarding the benefit of having these vocational centers, ensuring that that there's enough skills development and so on. So there was that there was a little bit of balance there, but notwithstanding, I mean, there was a lot of negativity and by Senator John when of course going back to the fact that the existing regime did not live up to expectations, and we don't have an issue with that. We recognize that. We did the work. We did the gap analysis, and we must fix it. It is our responsibility to fix what is not working. As I said, and my colleague, Senator Segram, made the point that since 2012, you would have had this gap analysis done by the World Bank, and nothing was done in 2012, 2013, 2014, etc. But it was our resolve, and this is why we allowed no new tenants into the free zone regime when we came in, reduced the number of employees, etc. We knew that we are on our way to setting up this entity. So we were very focused on fixing what was wrong. And in so doing, I mean, when you look at the work that you did, I can remember on that particular free zone board under the UNC being in office, you had 10. Imagine, you brought 3 new entities into the free zone regime during 2010 to 2015, but yet still you had a board of 10. You had a board which was greater than the number of employees working in the free zones company, and more board members than you had new entities entering the regime. Makes no sense at all. And so I mean, again, we took the decision. This must be fixed. Closed off the regime. And therefore, we put a board in place of just 3 persons. And of course, there was hardly any marketing and promotion done. It made no sense. We closed off the regime, and this was in line with the thinking of the OECD and Global Forum. this is what they wanted, and it made no sense of wasting taxpayers' monies because we were at money in terms of marketing and promotion and that kind of thing, because we were interested, and here we are in transition, and here we are making sure that this is materialized. There was a lot of nonsense too about the talk about the TTIFC, and I want to tell you that during 2010 and 2015, not one investment was brought in under the TTIFC by the UNC, and when they were in office at all. But I can tell you that under the astute of guidance and leadership of our Minister of Finance, he has really played a transformative role in terms of the transformation of TTIFC, and so that we expect good things coming in terms of the fintech industry in Trinidad and Tobago. And much heavy weather again made about InvestTT. I think InvestTT has been doing very, very, very well. They've really settled from what we inherited from you as a new organization. And they did, to their credit, both in 2021 and 2022, they would have brought on perhaps about at least $500 million in investments, but they would have created more than 2,000 jobs. And many of these jobs, you will say, but that sounds rather large, rather big. That's a big number. But it is the BPO industry, business process outsourcing industry, that a number of jobs were created. And they are now, InvestTT, being heavily involved in the marketing of the Phoenix Park Industrial Estate and the Maruga Agro-Processing Park as well. And the question, and again, let me just make the point about InvestTT. And I've said it in this House, and the Minister of Finance mentioned it in the budget as well, that InvestTT, more than likely, InvestTT and ExportTT are going to morph into this new regime. That new regime, which is the Trade and Promotion Investment Agency, will have the responsibility for marketing these zones and for marketing the entire regime. And that's the best thing, because what it means then is that all of the marketing and promotion in Trinidad and Tobago. This is separate from tourism, though, which has its own entities to market Trinidad and Tobago. This Trade and Promotion Agency will be very, very focused on sales and marketing. Excuse me. And they will take the responsibility of marketing this special economic zone regime. I think that the authority, will not be solely will not have the direct responsibility for the marketing of the regime. It is the new Trade and Investment Promotion Agency that will be very, very focused on sales and marketing that will have that responsibility. The question of consultation came up again, and I have to tell you that in addition to the international consultation which would have been done, as early as January 2017, we would have had, this is the Ministry of Trade and Industry, would have had consultation not only with the actual stakeholders, but also with the private sector bodies. They too would have been involved as early as 2017. And remember as well that the Minister would have answered in the last two budgets for fiscal 2022 and fiscal 2021, the Minister of Finance would have announced again this SEZ regime, which was in train and which we knew we would have been legislating upon. And I can tell you, if you had looked in the press at all, that there were loud praises for this new SEZ regime coming into being. So the consultation was done at the level of stakeholders and also the private sector bodies in Trinidad and Tobago. Senator Leiter, I mean, all these wild and false assertions that crime is pervasive on ETEX industrial parks, stay away from that, because, that is simply not true at all. And all discussion about cows and all that kind of thing. I don't know if you stand up and counting cows through industrial parks, but that is not so. There may be one or two on a particular park that you may have known of, And I mean, don't come here and make all of these wild assertions. I don't know what you're peddling. And of course, you're always asking the question, why don't you have a member of the TTMA on the board of ETEC? I've said it many times in this house. That is in fact so. It is in place. Roger Roach is the member of the executive of the TTMA who sits on ETEC's board. So we have taken that on. He's in place more than a year now. And again, you raised the concern, and this really sends the wrong messaging to the public, and I must clear it up, that ETEC got very little and insubstantial funding under the PSIP, and therefore what is the government focusing on in terms of ETEC? Well, there's no need for that. ETEC is an income receiving entity, income generating entity. It's supposed to be a profitable state enterprise. And the only reason that you saw something in the PSIP for the fire hydrants is because it's health and safety related. And therefore, we wanted to ensure that there was provision for that. But without a doubt, ETEC earns rents from all of its 20 industrial parks, from the and of course from the Hilton Hotel and the Martelina as well. So, and there is no need for any large provisions in the PSIP unless, of course, it's a new park that we are assisting with the financing and so on. And then, of course, you raised the whole question about every 5 years ETEC is raising the rent, etc., etc. That is standard. That every 5 years in every lease for an for an entity within an industrial estate, it is standard for every 5 years that you would have a review of the rates based on a market valuation. So if it goes down, it goes down. If it goes up, it goes up. But it's not just about imposing high rents. That's not the mandate of ETEC at all. The whole question, I think I attended to the marketing and communications to say that we really would get greater impact and results from this merger and of this trade and investment promotion activities into one organization. And someone raised the point about the one-stop shop. This is what it will be: a mega, internationally recognized sales and marketing institution. Dealing with exports and investments. And I think this is very forward-thinking, and we are all looking to the establishment of this trade and investment promotion agency. And until such time as it comes into place, of course, InvestTT will be on board. Senator David Ryan, I want to say that some of your concerns will be dealt with at the committee stage, but I wanted to acknowledge your contribution. And but you raised a point about the Vision 2030 document. You said Vision 2020. I assume that you meant Vision 2030 document has no zones identified, and that therefore there were. And you were concerned about the relationship with the new entity, the new proposed SEZ entity, authority, and the relationship with our national development strategy. So Vision 2030 is simply the very broad national development plan, and it does in fact speak to several sectors for development. But our roadmap to recovery, which is even more recent and which presents our transformational approach in terms of the economy, that document would detail many of the sectors earmarked for growth. But notwithstanding, we have recited several sectors and which are new. I think you had a little concern about the sectors being old and not being forward thinking. And in fact, I can tell you that there is an amendment dealing with new sectors to be included, and so it will include, as it includes some emerging sectors like the ICT sector, also the renewable energy sector as well. That's already included, and we will be including business process outsourcing. And because we have seen this as a sector for growth, earmarked for growth. And of course, we can certainly add sectors later on by order. So this is not fixed at all. And I would refer you to clause 86, where the minister may, by order, subject to negative resolution of the parliament, amend schedules 1, 2, 3, and 4. So there's room for expanding the sectors. And so it's absolutely not closed. I think I cleared up the question about whether or not the authority will be an operator in my opening remarks. So it's very clear that the Special Economic Zones Authority will and is not an operator. You raised the point of the strategic plan, and you will see that we would address that at the committee stage as well. And basically, I think the other things that you raised, you would find can be addressed at that point. Senator Timal, how much time do I have?
5, so you have just over 5 minutes left.
Yeah, thank you. So, Senator Timal, you had raised several questions about the planning, the Planning and Facilitation of Development Act. Bill, 2014, and you questioned you raised during your contribution, you raised several issues relating to land use planning, references to planning to the planning environment and so on, and what I want to say is, although that particular bill, the Planning and Facilitation Development Bill, is not fully proclaimed, I want to make the point that there have been improvements over the years regarding the planning and regulatory framework in Trinidad and Tobago. And while the TCPD prepares the full proclamation of the Planning and Facilitation Development Act, so that, for instance, there's been implementation of some important issues in terms of the automated development approval process, and of course there's been the digitization of all of the planning records of the TCPD and so on. And so I think that much work is going on, if that's your concern. And of course, and then I want to make the point again that the Planning and Facilitation Development Act, when it's fully proclaimed, will in fact facilitate all of the aspects of the operations of the SEC bill. And so again, you raise a question whether the partial proclamation of the Act, the PFD Act, whether it prevents the requirements of Part 7, Clause 30 regarding the designation of special economic zones from being undertaken. And it is that the current TCP Act will be able to address all of the land use planning matters that are listed in Clause 30 as relevant factors to consider when deciding whether to designate a geographical area as an SEZ and so on. So I think you also raised the point about qualified urban and regional planner from the private sector being included on the board of the SEZ authority, and as this will bring private sector planning expertise on the board. And again, Senator, while this may be helpful, we are of the view that it may not be necessary, since the Director of Planning of the National Planning Authority under the PAFD Act is proposed as an ex officio member of the board of the SEZ authority, and this should provide sufficient urban planning experience on the board. There was some confusion again raised. I think it would have been again Senator Deyalsingh, Senator Lutchmedial about the differences between the existing and the new regime, and I think we were very careful in citing all of the varied, especially designated zones that will now exist, and which is clearly different from the new, from the old one, where there was actually just one type of zone. Again, AG spoke to all of the transparency concerns with regard to the substantial activity, and so there's no need for me to go into this, the economic substance test, etc. The role of labor was discussed. I think Senator Deyalsingh, Senator Timal, Senator Richards raised the whole question of labor standards and relating to the importance of labor standards and decent work under this new regime. And we've taken all of these comments on board, and we wish the population to note that a key requirement for investors to be part of the SEZ regime is this whole question of creation of not just full-time jobs within our country, but decent jobs again. So it's very important, and we have taken on board all of your comments with regard to labor standards and so on. Senators Timal and Richards would have raised that issue of being physically present in a zone, and that is going to be dealt with via amendments. Yes? So we've taken that on board. Senator Richards also underscored the importance of conservation of the environment, and I'm happy to say, of course, and refer you to Clause 30, which deals with environmental standards to be considered in the designation of zones. Monitoring and compliance, I think the AG has dealt with, and generally, I think we're in a good place where this is promoted as a bill that not only relates to big business, but also to SMEs, and side by side, we will be paying attention to the ease of doing business and all of the other related issues that are important to us. Selling Trinidad and Tobago is a good place to do investments. Thank you.
Minister, the 4 magic words, please.
Mr. Vice President, I beg to move.
Honourable Senators, the question is that a bill entitled An Act to provide for the designation, development, operation, and management of special economic zones, the establishment of the Special Economic Zones Authority, the repeal of the Free Zones Act, Chapter 8107, the regulation of special economic zones, and matters related thereto, be now read a second time. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it.
A bill entitled An Act to Provide for the Designation, Development, Operation and Management of Special Economic Zones, the establishment of the Special Economic Zones Authority, the repeal of the Free Zones Act, Chapter 8107, the regulation of special economic zones and matters related thereto.
Honourable Senators, before I call on the Minister of Trade to put the question for committal, permit me to take a short break at this point in time, so this House will now stand suspended for 15 minutes.